Welcome to this webinar of the Regional Studies Association. Today, we're looking at a tool to assess the likelihood that a region's industry mix enables it to recover effectively from a pandemic or similar economic interruption. Host of this session, the Regional Studies Association, is a leading international network for research, development, and policy on urban and regional areas. The RSA provides information, networking opportunities, and grant and publication support, such as for this project. Events include the upcoming Regions in Recovery eFestival, a global collaborative event with free registration. It's coming up on the 2nd to the 18th of June, with information available on the RSA website. Today's session presents an angle on assessing the potential for recovery from economic shutdowns due to COVID-19. The focus is on regional economies across OECD countries. That is, one can assume that some regions may take longer to recover economically than others. Can we tell which ones will face the greatest hurdles and direct support to them, based on data on their employment in hard-hit industries and in resilient industries? And can such a tool be used effectively in different national settings? That is, are suitable data available to feed the tool, and is the determination of resilient industries, derived from US data, viable for those sectors in other countries? This pandemic risk and recovery economic tool was developed by a team of researchers from the US and Australia. The conceptual work and modeling were led by Professor Terry Clower of George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. He's a professor of public policy and director of GMU's Center for Regional Analysis. The center provides economic and public policy research services to the private, nonprofit, and public sectors. Prior to his academic roles, Terry spent 10 years in private industry in logistics and transportation management positions. The nitty-gritty of the modeling was handled by Dr. Keith Waters of George Mason University. Keith is founder of the consultancy Adaptive Regional Solutions, and he's a senior research associate and adjunct professor at Terry's Research Center. He earned a doctorate in public policy analysis from GMU in 2018. Chasing the data across the array of OECD countries was Jacob Irving. Jacob is a project officer in the business research team for the Dean of Research and Innovation, Professor Andrew Beer at the University of South Australia in Adelaide. He's currently working on projects related to place-based policy, industry restructuring, and the future of work. He obtained academic training in Melbourne and Lyon. There will be comments at the end of the presentation by RSA CEO Sally Hardy. She's grown the organization over the past 30 years. Her comments today are about one of her areas of focus and a key challenge in this project: availability of compatible data sets at similar granularity across different countries. Finally, I'm Will Rifkin, Emeritus Professor at the University of Newcastle, Australia. My specialty is the impact on decision-making of barriers to communication between experts and non-experts. That's relevant here in looking at the use of data and analysis by decision makers who are not fond of statistics and charts. In recent years, I've been accused of being an applied regional economist. However, my attorney insists that he has a good case for entrapment. Now on with this regional resilience assessment with an introduction by Professor Terry Clower.
So just a quick background on what we were doing. A year ago, a little over a year ago, as we started to see the economic devastation that was created by the pandemic, mostly from business shutdowns around it, there was an immediate need to start to understand which regional economies were going to be hit the worst. There were some notable efforts in the EU, the UK, and the US. We had groups like Brookings and others that started to play around with some indices that gave you a sense of what was the risk factor. So working with my colleague Andrew Beer and his team, and Will and his team, we decided to craft at least an initial version of a risk index. So because of the structure of a local economy, who was likely to see the worst of the economic disruptions? And this was a bit of a first cut at it. As we moved through, we had some success with that index, but as we moved through, it quickly became the thing about, okay, but how long is this going to last? What is the probability of recovery? And since the magnitude of the impacts are so great, there was no question that national governments, state governments, provisional governments, whatever, were not going to have the resources to basically just throw money everywhere. Although in the United States, given that we've spent a couple of $1 trillion, we're trying to just throw money everywhere. But the notion that we need to understand which regions were going to be most affected so that policymakers would have some kind of a tool to be able to decide about the allocation of these funds. So there was, fortunately, a conversation that I had with Ms. Sally Hardy, and the Regional Studies Association stepped up and provided some small grant scheme funding to specifically address issues around it. Many of you on this that are participating today may have received some of those grant fundings. We use that then to explore and to craft a recovery index. Today, what we want to do is review the findings of that initial effort. We applied the index not only to our home countries for those of us on the team between Australia and the US, but we applied it to some other OECD nations. So we want to review that with you, talk about the tool itself, get some of your feedback, and then the fortunate or unfortunate, as it may have turned out, what we learned from this as much as anything is that we have some data challenges. And these data challenges are going to require broader policy perspectives on accessibility to very timely economic data. And we want to conclude today's sessions with the discussion of that topic. So diving right in, the recovery index itself is designed to look specifically at the structure of the economy, the relative presence of industries that are resilient to the economic disruptions caused by the pandemic, how those industries that are resilient, how much do they represent of the local economy? And these could be a region, a local government area, or a functional economic area. And that's going to be a discussion for later in the program today. And then what we wanted to do was also to look at, are there any industries that appear to going to be longer in recovery than other industries? To demonstrate this, we looked at 6 different nations. I mentioned a couple of them before. We did the Republic of Ireland, Norway, the UK, US, and of course, Australia and New Zealand. So what are resilient industries? In the first several months of 2020, we looked at economic performance, job creation in the US. Fortunately, in the US, we have a pretty robust system of looking at labor markets and our data, and this is based, at least in this iteration, on employment job counts by industry. I'm sure there's other ways of doing it, but the jobs data come out pretty frequently and very recent data, at least in broad categories. So we found that the industries that appeared to be most resilient included food manufacturing. Kind of makes sense. We continue to eat. That's not saying that there wasn't disruptions in supply chains, but food manufacturing continued. Certain types of manufacturing, particularly non-metallic minerals, civil engineering, construction projects continued. In the US, we considered, and I think the other countries as well, considered construction workers to be essential employees. So they were allowed to be on the job, even if they were having to make other social distancing, masking, and other kind of adaptations. They did not shut down. And of course, from a governmental standpoint, the construction of infrastructure especially is one that was continued on. as stimulus spending. In other words, keep the publicly funded construction project going on so that there would be that job creation and spinoff economic impacts. Warehousing, of course, one of the things that we all know now is that we continue to consume services. The consumers across the world are figuring out ways of getting their Amazon deliveries or whatever it would be. So that warehousing, and we use the warehousing sector as a proxy for overall logistics systems, because we still needed to move goods around, whether, whatever those were. Computer programming related services, particularly in terms of data services, because we've all at home, we're consuming Zoom as we speak. The internet retail operations. So all of that related to the computer programming, information services, downstreaming all of our Netflix shows and all of that kind of stuff. Financial services continued on to be strong. Insurance services, professional services. But in the categorizations that we use in the United States, the NAICS, which is Canada, the US, and Mexico, all sharing the North American classification system, professional services are divided into two broad categories. The professional side, which are lawyers, engineers, scientists, research and development services. And then there's a section that are things like services to building, personnel agencies, security guards. We separated those two out because we found distinct differences in those. So in the professional services, it was one that we're looking at trained, degreed, those type of services. Public administration, of course, government kept functioning as an essential service. The detracting industries, in our view, the thing that we're going to see that's going to be longer in recovery will especially be business-based air travel. We expect, as things loosen up, and we're already starting to see it some in the US, is that folks who have been cooped up all year are just chomping at the bits to go out and travel. But business travel is going to be somewhat constrained. And of course, for many of our communities, business travel is the high value added aspect. These are folks that are staying in $300, $400 a night hotel rooms. They're consuming the car hire services, things like that. So you're going to see, as we're showing here in a picture, of course, the area that what you're thinking of is seeing an airport with lots of folks moving around is probably not going to be so much the case. We're going to see individual travelers like our young lady. And of course, what we have to know is that she's wearing a mask too. And that we expect that many of the premier business-oriented hotels are going to have pictures much like what you see on the right there, an empty lobby for some time to come, or a near empty lobby. It's just, we expect that it's going to be some time, and could be a couple of 3 years even, in the recovery of business travel. And some folks are actually forecasting that business travel may never come back to quite the way it was. I'm not sure if that's going to be the case, but we certainly see that would create regional differences. Those regions, those communities who have been particularly reliant on business air travel. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Waters, who's going to describe the actual index score.
All right, so I'll just briefly talk about this before I go into the countries that we looked at, and we'll take a look at the various outcomes. So in general, the recovery index is, it's basically two components. You have this location component, and then you have the regional component of a shift share analysis. So equation one is basically just, the reliance on those resilient industries that Terry had talked about. Equation two, and then it sort of boils into equation three, is this regional component of a shift share analysis. And so all that this is trying to do is to capture the competitiveness of those resilient industries over the recent past. So what was their trajectory prior to the pandemic, and then we just weight this for a shift share, or we weight this for our shift share factor. And then, as he said, we have this these detracting industries, which are air travel and those accommodations, and we just include those as sort of this simple interaction term, and we subtract that off. The sum of the industry location quotients, and then that shift share factor. So it's a relatively simple index, but if you go to the next slide, at least for the US case, it seems to be working relatively well. So this is the United States case, which is what at least myself is most familiar with, and also probably Dr. Clower. In general, so what you see is sort of along the coast where tourism tends to be more prevalent. Those are the regions that we assume are going to have the hardest time recovering. So if we just look at if we're looking at the table, those places that are ranked higher are going to be they're going to recover more quickly. And so these are places like Sweetwater, Texas, Dodge City, Kansas, Vinland, Bridgeton, New Jersey. A lot of these places are relatively small, so they kind of get pushed around quite a bit by those location quotients. But at the bottom, these are the places that we were trying to identify. It's not so much the top, it's more of the places towards the bottom. And so these are places where, if you're trying to funnel public resources, these are places that may need help. For those folks not familiar with the US, you are likely familiar with some of these places. Kailua, Hawaii, Las Vegas is obviously a very big gambling hub. Ketchikan, Alaska is actually also a tourist hub. That's a bunch of sort of cruise ships coming in and out of Ketchikan, Alaska. Kapa, Hawaii is, again, it's in Hawaii, so it's another tourist destination. And then Atlantic City is also reliant on tourism for gambling and so forth. If we look at year-over-year employment change or unemployment change for this recovery index, in September, so if we just do a simple correlation between the recovery index that we calculated and then year-over-year change in unemployment, from September 2019 to September 2020, we had just a simple correlation coefficient of 0.42. It shifted, it shifts over time. So in October, it was 0.44. And in November, it was 0.36. So basically, the measure is capturing what we anticipated it to, and it seems to be relatively well and sort of stable over time. So as far as it's concerned, we are relatively happy with it. The thing that I'd like to point out before we move into the other countries that we're looking at is that the U.S., which is this is based on sort of for timeliness of data issues, is that we have 933 metropolitan statistical areas. And so these are basically labor market areas that are based on commuting patterns. And so these are, as folks travel in and out of work, they make cross counties or sort of township boundaries. And so you're actually moving from sort of the suburbs towards the city, and that is what the US is based on. Obviously, the US is very large, so there's quite a few of these. If we shift to the UK, so you can go to the next slide. The UK actually also has quite a few local authorities, which is what we use. Up at the top, we have ranked number 1, sort of the most quick to recover is likely to be the City of London. But then looking down at the places that are likely to recover more slowly, these are places like Hounslow, Hillington, West Sussex. We do have Kensington and Chelsea, but then other places like Manchester down there at the bottom. But what you'll notice is that these places are much smaller than sort of this metropolitan statistical area that we have in the US. You can go to the next slide. So looking at the Republic of Ireland, this is actually sort of where this idea of geographic unit becomes very obvious. So the Republic of Ireland only has 8 regional authorities, so we calculate the same index. So we have Midwest recovering the fastest, and then down sort of toward the bottom are the Southwest and the West, at least in the Irish case. The Irish Department of Finance relatively recently identified the city of Galway as the most at-risk city in Ireland. So this does match up with some other independent research, but there are very few regions in Ireland just overall. And you can hit next. In Norway, this is also the case. So we only had 11 regions for Norway. So you have Oslo at the top, which is going to recover presumably recover the quickest. Down towards the bottom, you have Agder. And so Agder, the Agder region's largest city, Christianland, is actually relatively small, especially compared to the US context with just over 60,000 people. And given how small it is, it also has, its economy is, it will be relatively less diversified, just sort of lack of labor force. But it has low location quotients and things like warehousing and storage, those professional and technical services that Dr. Clower had mentioned, as well as information services. So these are the resilient industries. And so places like Christianland are not really high in those resilient industries that we've identified. And so you can hit next. New Zealand is again another country with relatively few regions, and so up there at the top, recovering the fastest are going to be Auckland and Wellington, and down towards the bottom are places like Nelson, Gisborne, and Tasman. Nelson and Tasman are actually were relatively low regarding output going into it, so this is sort of doubly concerning since you're going into the pandemic sort of struggling along to begin with. Having this come along is not particularly helpful to the economic development of those places. Gisborne is a little bit actually surprising, has been a surprising bright spot, actually, because Gisborne, while it is a tourism destination, it actually tends to cater towards the local New Zealand population, which has generally been freely mobile within the country. So Gisborne actually has come out of this relatively well compared to our expectations. And you can hit next. That is not perhaps the case with in Australia with places like Cairns, which actually caters to a much more international population. And so it is my understanding, and Jacob and Will can speak more to this probably, that Cairns is not recovering perhaps quite as fast because it is more international tourism based. On the note of Australia, you will note that we now have quite a few more regions, back to up to 86. However, as compared again with the US case, places like Sydney and Melbourne are broken down into sort of more than one area, as opposed to you have this sort of commuting shed or functional economic area, as you may call it. And so with that, I think I'll hand it back over to either Terry or Jacob for the next slide.
All right, so thanks for that, Keith. One of the things, and of course, it was interesting in looking at the U.S. context. So you have a town called Sweetwater, Texas. Now, I have actually been to Sweetwater, Texas. I do not recommend it to anybody looking for a good time. This is one of those kind of communities where the main form of entertainment is watching tumbleweeds blow through town. No, it really, their structure of their economy is they've got a little bit of oil and gas, cattle, and cotton. So it's very agricultural dominated. And that's one of the reasons you see them appearing more resilient, is that those things that talk about the travel industry, moving around, big retail centers, Sweetwater is none of those, right? And so that's why they are more resilient. It is their structure. And having said that, then, being at the top of that list, if you were directing state resources, they're not in need as much as some other communities that we identified. So in that sense, we see it as pretty useful. We find overall that we think that the index can be a useful tool for policymakers. Obviously, this is a little bit of looking back, but we may have these kind of events again. And so what we're wanting to do is any type of a disaster event that is health related or impacts our ability to travel, we think that this tool would be fine. Now, there is some key notes that we want to make. The tool is agnostic about the timing of vaccine therapeutics, or as we've seen in the United States, where the whole practice of safety has become a political discussion as opposed to a practical discussion of being safe. And so we're having to hold all of this constant. This is very much just the structure of the economy. Now, we are, though, wanting to look back. Have we identified the correct resilient industries? Are there industries that we thought would recover or slower to recover? So this is going to be one that, as good scientists, we want to take this and do additional work for it. Sadly, we're happy to ask for more money, but absent that, either way, we would like to see this go on. We want to see also to better understand that appropriate geography, because there's some of the things about the pandemic that are changing that. So will air travel, especially the business air travel, will it come back quicker than expected? Will we be so anxious to get back in front of our clients that we're willing to do so? I don't know. I think there lots of sales functions I think are continuing and have continued on. It's those intra-organizational meetings that likely will see a longer term coming back. But also, one of the things that we have to wonder is this working from home. How is that actually going to shape, and how does that shape the way we think of our data? Because if I'm working remotely 80%, 90% of the time, and I choose, instead of living in the national capital region of the US, I'm going to teach my classes remotely, and I'm going to live in the Outer Banks of North Carolina on the seashore, right? It's entirely possible with this technology. But think about then how that starts to impact our data. How is the job location and your home location connected? That's how, as Keith suggested, in the US, when we define metropolitan areas, that's the primary factor that goes into it. There are other factors, but the primary factor is commuting patterns, the effective labor shed. Well, if we start disconnecting work and home geographically, then you think about the challenges that has with the data. And with that, I want to move our discussion more broadly into the issues with data. And to do that, we're going to ask Jacob to describe a little bit about the joys he had in actually pulling together all of these data.
Fantastic. Thank you, Terry, for that. So like Terry said, I'll be talking about some of the data challenges and issues we came across when looking for data to put through our index. So for our index, we were looking for a certain level of disaggregation for both of the industry of employment as well as the regional geography to show the propensity to recover from COVID-19 at a granularity that could be acted on at the regional level. So in an EU context, this mostly equated to NUTS 3 regions and the industry level of NACE level 2. So this is one level more granular than the broad classifications that you may be familiar with of A, B, C, D, and so on. And so an additional nice to have requirement we had was recency. We were looking for data as close as possible to March 2020. And so the granular level of disaggregation that we were looking for was unfortunately not present on transnational databases such as through the OECD and Eurostat. This left me with the task to seek out regional level data individually for each country. So this meant I needed to obtain a list for all of the geographical and industry terminologies for each OECD nation, obtain a list for all of the statistical authorities for each OECD nation, and further determine where the data tools were for each country, or whether indeed these data tools existed at all within each statistical authority. Then onwards, I'd find which databases within each tool would cover the data we needed, determine if the data was publicly available or perhaps it costed a fee, then finally determine if the data was granular enough at the end of this process. And so once we obtained some data, there was also issues of translating all of it into a consistent format that our code could analyze. This may sound relatively straightforward, and it can be in some cases, but it was very much a time-consuming process for us. This process might sound somewhat familiar to what people here have done before, as it approximates to the standard task of data acquisition undertaken at the beginning of numerous projects. The challenge here, though, for us became that we were replicating it 20 or so times for relatively idiosyncratic systems, which ultimately takes an excessive amount of time, especially as my familiarity with data quality as well as releases was exclusive to Australia at the time. Eventually, after gaining more insight into framing what data we needed, I send an email to all of the statistical authorities, or most of them, from the OECD countries, asking for precisely the data we wanted. Itself in a task to document which correct email address I needed to send my inquiries to as well. Off the back of that, a lot of no's were received, a lot of negative responses were received, for the primary reason being that data at this level was not reliable and therefore not producible. Or secondly, that this data was not available to the requested recency that we were looking for. This required a degree of adaptability on our part, which we chose to be seeking less recent data. So for cases of Republic of Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand, the most recent data that was available to us was the census data, and that was used as our pre-COVID benchmark to use at this desired disaggregation. Now, the problem with this in the Australian context in particular is this data can be quite old, and being 2016, 5 years ago, was where we use Australia's data, and really since then our economic landscape has changed somewhat. There is certainly the possibility that for the countries we looked at, there may have indeed been data we wanted and that it perhaps was publicly available. However, after months of investigation, the question becomes at a point a matter of resources in terms of time. How long do we spend trying to increase our sample number or finding the ideal data set, and indeed not knowing the answer to whether that data existed or not? And so here I've mainly elucidated some challenges we've found in our process of looking for data. But I must give credit to the European Union's Eurostat and the OECD statistical data spaces, as what they've done is clearly fantastic work. The issue, though, for us became at a point we weren't willing to make sacrifices on our target geography and our industry disaggregation. So foremostly, we wanted to provide meaningful data that could be acted upon at the regional level. And secondly, choosing to do anything other than break down sectors such as transport into subclassifications as air transport and road transport. To not do that seemed a bit nonsensical, as air transport would have seen a decline in economic strength, where road transport would have experienced an uptick in several regions. Looking forward, we might like to see an increase in data harmonization and adoption of transnationally comparable data. There is an issue that creating new standards may sacrifice the benefit of time series data and looking at changes over time, but nevertheless, that would pave a path forwards, facilitating transnational research as the accessibility of data increases. So that's mainly been my experience. And Terry, I might turn to you here to talk more about some of the other implications of these challenges.
Sure, and thank you for that, Jacob. And understand, folks, we knew going in that there would be some challenges. We had hoped to be able to use the standardizations out of OECD data to broadly do it. We set out with the goal of doing as many of the nations in the OECD data set as we possibly could. And we just wound up with, consistent challenges. And even some of the issues that we do of the differences between, what is a functional economic area versus an administrative area. And let's think of the difference of, if you will, think of the London area. So you have the top in our index for the UK, city center London, with its financial sector, the international business activity. Of course, it's very resilient. And within that, though, you also have, in that same area, even within the same commuting shed, you have Hounslow, which is essentially, for those that are unfamiliar with the area, is the geography immediately around Heathrow Airport. And, and so they're very heavily impacted. But if you think about it from a functional economic area, maybe they're about the same. So, it's that differential going between those of, is it an administrative area and is that the area? Because here's the other issue, is that allocation of funding for relief is likely going to follow administrative boundaries, not necessarily economic boundaries, functional economic areas. So this is where we remain with a challenge between what is the most appropriate geography. This is especially true, and you look at the disaggregations in the Australian and New Zealand context. I believe, what area, if you notice that the most resilient areas, if you'll recall from that chart in Australia, was various parts of Sydney, the Sydney metro area. Right. And so is that really, do we need to separate those? And of course, the thing is that if you do it appropriately, because of almost the dichotomy in growth in Australia over the last few decades, where the major capital cities have grown tremendously and many of the regional cities have struggled to retain population. You could have just such huge variations in size that you might have data quality because of disclosure issues, which are always a concern in business data. Are you getting down to where the data are reflecting just one or two firms that, you know, and so that's a key concern on some of that kind of stuff. And so we wind up with the broad timing of availability. Recency certainly matters, as Jacob mentioned. Having to do data where we're looking at something that happened 5 years ago, you know, one thing we can say for sure we know is that the world of 2021 is definitely different than the world of 2019. You know, going forward, we're always going to have a little asterisk next to 220 when we're looking at 2020, when we're looking at data. So one of the things that we talk about broadly here, we have this categorization here on the slide called data harmonization, is that for those of us that are engaged in research, as we recognize that the economy is increasingly, it is globalized in many respects anyhow, and has been for a while, but it is increasingly globalized. You know, the boundaries between, you know, our multinational corporations operating on multiple continents, these are requiring for us to understand the patterns of growth and what it means to be regional, that we need better harmonization. And that's good for business efficiency, to have better standards of data, that businesses, you know, that are managing facilities in multiple countries can operate and have feedback mechanisms. So one of the issues is, should we have and move to an era of data cohesion policy that allows us better to respond to economic disasters? You think about, you know, the way the global financial crisis disrupted economies across the globe. This pandemic has disrupted economies across the globe, business and trade efficiency. And then, of course, for those of us that are studying policy and regional economics and economic geography, that whole efficiency of delivering services across different kind of boundaries. And with that, what I want to do is to our leader and our colleague in this, Sally Hardy, we've been talking about this for a while, and she's had some recent conversations with some folks, and I'd like to bring her on now to talk about what that is and where the RSA can play a role in moving forward to address some of these data issues that we're talking about.
Hi, everybody, and thanks very much for that lead in, Terry. I appreciate that, and thanks very much for the presentation. It's really fascinating, and there are some really obvious questions. I won't talk for very long because I see the questions are piling up, but I'd like to add one question, which is, why aren't health services on your resilient industries? You know, you've got 10 resilient areas. Why is med tech not there when we've had the whole thing about ventilators and I suppose the companies doing PPE are picked up under other headings. Anyway, that was beside the point. So data, the Regional Studies Association is a kind of empirically focused association. Data has always been an issue for the 30 odd years that I've worked here, and it's risen to the top of the agenda on many occasions, and we've made many interventions at a national and supranational level around data cohesion, as it's more commonly known now. Again, data is pretty high up the global agenda. A lot of the focus on data is actually post-publication data strategies. So now we have things like data availability statements that have to be given once people have published, are publishing their research. We can all access fair share policies. There are data repositories that are fair aligned so that you can know how the data is going to be treated. Even journals, individual journals have their own data repositories. For regional studies, we use Figshare as our data repository. But all of this is after the research has been done. And I think there is, the focus has been taken off the availability of the data that feeds into that research. And that's where the board, the RSA board, is interested in making some interventions. We will do that by building a kind of coalition of stakeholders that are interested in the kind of data that researchers in our field are using. And that will be led by the kind of materials that we're currently publishing in regional studies, which I suppose is our blue chip empirical research-led journal. But also, if you look at regional studies, regional science, which is our gold open access journal, if you look at the increasing numbers of regional graphics that are coming out in that, you can see that this kind of core interest and need for reliable and available data is not going away. If anything, the pace is hotting up. So we've spoken already to colleagues at the European Commission who have already committed to talking with us about data availability, about what can be done. They have similar problems in accessing reliable data at appropriate levels of granularity across the EU and beyond for the purposes of comparison. We would certainly seek to involve our sister associations like the European Regional Science Association, the British and Irish section of Regional Science Association International, but also organisations such as ESOP. And then also there are movements of academics that are not formal societies like FinGeo, where looking at financial geographies, where again, these data questions are not going away. So the idea is that we will ask a number of questions to these organisations to try and hone down on what are the key problems, what are the key areas, and what can be done about it. We will seek to involve colleagues at OECD. There are several sections of OECD where we might find like minds, but also places like UN Habitat, where we have high-level contacts there who will similarly be looking for this kind of international harmonization of data. So I just wanted to highlight that during the pandemic year, we repurposed the money that was going into our research networks funding scheme, because it wasn't possible for people to meet so directly. And some of the money that we repurposed from that has paid for this research project. As we begin to emerge from the pandemic, these funding streams will restart, and it would be absolutely wonderful, colleagues in the room, if we were to have some applications from people that want to make data the focus of a research network that we could fund, and with whom we could work to try and forward our understanding and our impact on discussions around data. So I think I've made the points that I wanted to make about this. I did want to make one closing comment about the research that you've done, which I find very pleasing about it, which is that it's so much place-based. So you have the cities and the regions showing up on the index, but unless you know something about those regions, it's hard to understand why they're behaving in the way that they are. And it's that focus on place really, I think, brings this research to life for me, and really makes it, I think, a very valuable tool for policymakers. And I won't say any more because the clock's ticking and Will has a tough job now with the questions in the Q&A box. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sally. So we'll go to the questions now, and here's one. A series of questions have been asked, and a few of them have been voted up by some of you in the audience. This one is, did you consider to use a geographically weighted shift share analysis to control for the development of neighboring areas? Sounds like Terry and Keith, that would be you.
Sure. And I'll respond to two questions real quickly. And that one specifically, Will, we did not in this initial iteration. That's something we certainly thought about, and it's a good idea to look. It would be, we might try that a little bit and see what the sensitivity of the index is to such a measure. Certainly adjacency has an issue and the spillover effects, but that's why particularly in the US where we were using the metropolitan areas, we were hoping to control that. There are certainly spillover effects between different metropolitan areas, but understanding that our emphasis being on labor shed may change that a little bit. But I actually think that's a great idea, and we could try that, do some simple calculations and just see how it runs out. To get back to a question that Sally brought up about the health services, actually health services were not resilient. In the US, we saw a decline in healthcare services employment, largely because of the restrictions on elective procedures, we call them. You certainly weren't doing things like arthroscopic knee surgeries and things like that. It was only emergency procedures. So there was, and indeed in the US system, a lot of the high profitability services for the medical professions were the ones that were curtailed. The other issue, and this really shows up an issue, and I don't have an easy answer for this one, but in the process of looking to address the need for specific medical equipment like ventilators, we had manufacturing firms that would never categorize themselves as being a medical equipment manufacturer who were stepping up and providing medical equipment. So our industry categorizations wouldn't even capture their gain in employment as being something related to healthcare equipment, because that's not their primary commodities. Remembering that any of our categorizations, they're self-categorized as being, what do you do the most? So, and so, yeah, but it was really odd that, everybody went in thinking that, oh gosh, hospitals are going to see a lot of increased employment because of this. And that actually did not turn out to be the case. So go ahead, Will. Thank you.
Okay, good. Next question. There's a lot going on in different national contexts. How much of the variation can an index such as this capture that sort of thing? For example, Norway, for lots of reasons, some policy, some not, was not hit anywhere near as much as, say, the UK. This would likely have been true even with identical industrial structure.
And so, yeah, and that's again is a great question. It's one that, as we said, this was not meant to take into account other things like accessibility and even behavioral issues. This is only, we kind of have to draw the box around, and this is one that, what are your risks based on your industrial structure, your economic structure? If you want to be a nation that wants to say, you're interfering with my personal rights, making me wear a mask in public, like we've seen in the US, I can't do anything about that from a planning perspective, kind of thing. So yes, that is certainly something that we have to take into account, and where we hope this is it is not a definitive tool, it is a helpful tool.
Okay, great. And here's one again, cross-national comparison. Do you have Asian countries in the sample? Did we look for Asian countries? Maybe you could contrast a different recovery path to those Western countries investigated.
And that gets to a data issue. Using the OECD nations, it was a data issue. And there, quite frankly, we also ran into, in terms of trying to track down the data from individual agencies, we wound up with some language barrier issues. So that certainly is something we would like to explore, and as we proceed with this, but this was just one of data being readily available and that we could actually use, and our own skills within the team on being able to read data sets from various languages.
So luckily, though, the numerals are Arabic, even if the words are in different languages. Good. What weaknesses in government policies to stimulate economic recovery seemed evident in the research, or in comparing the research findings with what you saw in the news?
we haven't done that officially yet, and I would not want to just get into a lot of anecdote, except to say that you will notice that our correlations, certainly showing that the tool is useful, but we're a long way from being perfectly predicted at this sign. So we anticipate that we're going to see that local and particularly in the US state level policies. See, unlike many of the other nations, a lot of this, the differences that we have in performance is based on relatively local and regional government actors making different choices. Things like, governors deciding which businesses can be open and which have to be closed, what the limitations are. We have 50 states plus the District of Columbia, and we had 51 different regimes, on how we were doing things.
Here's a data question. Gathering compatible data across a number of countries sounds daunting. What are the one or two things that would make that easier? If we could ask the national statistical offices to pull up their socks.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'll take this one.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think it's hard to target nations individually as they have developed their systems over time. Nevertheless, the challenge that I would perhaps like to see addressed, if there were one, would perhaps be to have a standard for presenting data and even adopting the same database search tools that are used across countries. In my own experience, I know this is somewhat possible, as I found several countries that use the same back-end software. And when I came across a country that had the same back-end software, it was relatively easy to filter through the databases, the data sets, as well as to actually construct the tables to get the data we wanted. Oh, and even if they didn't have the data we wanted, I was still able to quickly go through that process. So that's one thing which for me was really helpful. So that was my takeaway.
Here's one. Where can one find the results on resilient and detracting industries in Norway based on the discussed index?
I can reach it. If you reach out to us,
Okay,
we're happy to send those along.
What could be done to promote the use of the tool to policymakers?
I think that's much of a communication. And one of the things that we will be doing is of course, letting folks know as we gain confidence in the outcome of this one. And we're trying to do that as timely as possible because things are going on now. But of course, at this point, I think a lot of government action has been very much shotgun approach, throw out the resources and the support. I think as it goes along, we'll look as the debates happen in the US on the next rounds of funding, they'll be more targeted. So it's a matter of reaching out to the right policymakers. And that's going to be different process in each of our countries. But this is where an organization like RSA, who has established relationships with key policymakers across several different entities, can actually help us be a communication channel.
And a hopeful sign was when the initial pandemic index came out about a year ago, there was a lot of media interest. So it's something that captures the attention.
Yeah, if I might just interject, yeah, we have done quite a lot of promotion already of this tool, and we have drawn it to the attention of colleagues in various directorates of the European Commission. There will always be more that we can do, but we've run several presentations already about it. So I think for what is funded at a micro level of funding, this research has had a completely disproportionate impact in terms of the tool that it's developed. And obviously, we'd like to promote that further to the policy world, and we're hoping to do that through the forthcoming EU Regions Week, which brings together 6,000 policymakers and practitioners from around Europe, and this will be one of the focuses. Thank you.
Okay, great. A question about describing the data. This person says, I was surprised that cities and capitals were so resilient. whereas they should also have the most business air travel activities. So what might be an explanation of those mechanics?
So I'll if Keith wants to run this, but I'll tell you my initial impression is governments kept operating and government centers keep functioning, and even if they were sending their staffs home, that it wasn't that they were being laid off. They kept, so government is, and living in the DC region, the National Capital Region, government areas are usually resilient to any kind of economic downturn. And so it kind of, there's other forces that go on with that. But remember that most government agencies considered themselves to be essential services and kept operating, now that didn't apply for like school systems and some things like that, that are oftentimes that are, for many of us, are government functions as well. But I think it was just the matter of the administrative functions provide an underpinning to those government centers.
Here's one. How can one use the index to make trade-offs in terms of sector budget support to revive vulnerable regions? So how do you use the index to say we're going to fund that region and not the other region, or this sector, not that sector?
Well, and that becomes a political question. And what we want to do is at least provide decision makers with a tool that is somewhat dispassionate data, that gives them a data reason, not just a political influence reason, to redirect resources from one geography to another. Because the receiving entity, the receiving governmental units or areas will always say we are in need. And the ones that, so and remember what we used to call pork barrel politics in the US, where if the money is coming to me, it is a sound, wise investment of public resources. If it's going to somebody else, it's obviously wasteful spending. So what we want this tool to do is to help put some rationality in that decision making, or at least to provide some political cover for those decisions, for those wise decisions.
So here's one that reminds me of some of the debate in India, where Modi's keeping the country open, not locking it down as much as some people say you should. Would it help in analyzing the rate of economic recovery to have data on vaccination rates or the adherence to social distancing protocols? So is there a way, maybe not this analysis, but a different version to look at factors like that?
Keith, you want to take that one?
I mean, as far as it's concerned, this is fairly agnostic to that. And I think, as Terry had mentioned, there's a lot of social things that are not taken into this. We can't predict how, who and how many people are going to wear masks, and how quickly vaccines are going to come out. So these are things that we really can't comment on, because it's just way too far outside the realm of predictability.
What if you got some of that movement data, like from Apple and Google on human movement? To what extent are people staying at home? Is that something you could work with?
It's something we could certainly do. And Will, I'm happy for you to dedicate your life to the next couple of 3 months, unfunded, by the way, to explore that. As you know, I'm being, because I think those are all important questions, but it's one that, again, that our purpose here was to provide as quickly as we could a base tool that at least was saying, on the fundamentals of your structure of your economy, where is the risk? And keeping in mind is as we get more data coming in, particularly we've seen that Australia has different data, they're starting to release some data more widely available than when we started this process. So we want to go back and now, and it's that process, good academic research is never done. It's not the perfect thing. Our industry definitions may be off a little bit. Using the notion of a different shift share calculation might give us a better model out of it, and we certainly want to explore that. So this is the continual improvement kind of thing. And so bringing in some of those issues about, I think it would be a given, though, that you could say, if you're not getting the vaccines distributed to regional economies, those regional economies are going to have a harder time recovering from this. That's almost a given.
So going back to the nature of academic research, what every academic wants is to be cited. So if you could recommend research topics that bounce off this one, what are some ideas for research topics that some of the people in the audience might pick up and run with, or that you might run with in the future?
Well, I think there's two broad things here. First of all, this notion of how do massive global events affect all of our economies. I think that understanding that structure, because this really shows how interconnected we are. Look at the rapidity at which this disease spread across the globe. Even as folks were trying to shut down, there are no closed borders practically anymore. We may do our best to do that, but even then, things can get through. So all of that, the social dynamics, the integration of our economies, and how we are more so than many want to believe interdependent on each other, and how we do things, I think is something that we could continue to look at from a research perspective. And then, of course, the one that we came up with that we discussed with Sally and her team, this whole notion that this really calls out this need for data harmonization in the way it's accessible. And we have patterns of that. You think about it, we have in terms of trade and the way we apply tariffs, we have standardized commodity classifications. We have models for doing that and applying it both in terms of to industries, or maybe as we move forward and industries become more complicated and workers themselves become more important, we spread this into occupational categories. Because there is some consistency across nations in the nature of the way, the jobs that we do. So I think that would be, those are a couple of the broad sectors, if you get to where understanding interconnections across global systems, and of course, then the data issues. And Sally, you may have some ideas that you'd want to encourage.
Yes, I think nothing specific at the moment. We would be led by the researchers, but we will set up some focus groups and meetings to try and progress this. It's absolutely key, and the pandemic has really brought it into sharp relief. Some other things have worked very well. So publishers making research freely available, no paywalls for anything that's COVID related. It shows that there can be, and there is this kind of will for international sharing for mutual benefit. And data is so fundamental to that. Thank you.
Well, we've reached the end of the hour. So I'd like to thank the audience members for their questions, and thank my colleagues, fellow members of the team, for their more than adequate responses. And it sounds like the tool represents a step forward in assessing the pandemic's potential long-term impact in certain regions. And there, those that'll face more challenges in terms of recovery. There are key issues that remain about the availability of suitably granular data. We as a research team, and I'm sure Sally, will look forward to seeing you at future RSA events. So for this evening, goodbye.
Thank you.